Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Isaac Cates and Mike Wenthe. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, one of the two guys with PhDs talking about comics, and on this interview episode, I have the pleasure of talking with two other guys with PhDs who like to talk about comics. In fact, they like to create them. Isaac Cates and Mike Wenthe. I have a great time talking with them about their comic, Cartozia Tales, but before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials, and January is no exceptions. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off the cover price, sometimes you'll find them at 50% off cover price, but often the discounts can get more impressive than that. In fact, if you check out their website right now, you'll find 50% off bundles from such publishers as Marvel, DC, Vertigo, and Valiant. They have specials every single month. You have to go to the website and check out what all of them are. That's Discount Comic Book Service. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. And as you're waiting for your order of comics to come in from Discount Comic Book Service, go ahead and brew yourself a nice cup of coffee. And where are you going to get great coffee? From our other sponsor, and that is Just Coffee Co-op. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified. What's more, it's roasted to order. They do it in small batches, no mass production. If you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, that's justcoffee.coop, and upon checkout, use the coupon code COMICS, COMICS, that's our coupon code, and you will get 10% off of your order. And on top of that, shipping is always free. So go to Just Coffee Co-op, that's justcoffee.coop, and on checkout, use our coupon code COMICS. You'll be glad you did. It's a great place to get caffeinated. I had a really nice conversation with Isaac Cates and Mike Wenthe about their comic Cartozia Tales, and in fact, they are about to release issue 9 of this 10-issue series. We had a wonderful time talking about that title, among other things, such as how they met one another in graduate school, the kind of comics that they've worked on together, and basically the genesis of the Cartozia Tales series. There was a lot that we covered in that conversation, so let's go ahead and start listening to what we talked about. I'm happy to have on the Comics Alternative Isaac Cates and Mike Wenthe. They are the creative minds behind Cartozia Tales. Guys, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Oh, it's nice to be here.
And you guys are two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. Yeah, Mike and I actually met while we were in grad school at Yale getting our PhDs in English.
Wow, too bad Kunka is not with us because he and I met in grad school, and then we could have kind of almost a mirroring effect going on with this interview.
Yeah, it would be. It would be. I'm picturing like a tag team is what I'm picturing. I think a tag team match,
like a tag.
Yeah,
like a tag team, or maybe a double mint gum commercial. So, many of our listeners may know about Cartozia because we've mentioned it on the podcast a few times in the past, when you had your original Kickstarter campaign going. But that's been a little while. So for those who are uninitiated, describe Cartozia to everyone.
Okay. Cartozia Tales is an all-ages fantasy comic. In each issue, there are 9 different stories and assorted other materials, and the 9 stories are drawn by 9 different cartoonists. All the stories are set in the same world, and as we plan each issue, each of the cartoonists is shuffled to a different part of the world map so that nobody gets to draw this in the same area twice in a row, or indeed twice at all yet. I think in the 10th issue, everybody's going to get to revisit someplace that they've already worked. And there's a group of 7 people who are in every issue, and then we bring in 2 indie comics rock stars to guest star for us in each issue. So, like issue number 2 has James Kochalka in it. Issue 3 has Kevin Cannon, and so forth. And it's all ages, which means that it's safe for kids to read it, but it's entertaining, I think, for grown-ups. We try really hard not to dumb it down, even though we're giving it to kids. We just try to keep it fun and smart and interesting, and to indulge our imaginations in whatever way we can.
Except for using swear words, which we omit for the sake of the young minds.
Right, yeah, I've noticed that it definitely does have that all-age feel to it, and I think that is exemplified through, I guess, the work of one of the, as you put it, the Rockstar creators who appeared in issue 2, Kalchaka, because, he does have, super effer comics, but most of his stuff seems to be all age in a very good way, something that can be appreciated by all readers, and that's the feel that I get from Cartozia Tales.
Yeah, I think James's recent stuff, he's been most prolific working on stuff for all ages. Although I think that his, I think Johnny Boo and even Glorkian Warrior kind of skew a little younger for audience than Cartozia Tales winds up skewing. Mm-hmm. I don't think that hasn't been really deliberate on our part, but I feel like my son, who is almost 5, totally gets Johnny Boo and Glorkian Warrior and can basically read the books himself with no help. Cartozia Tales is a little denser than that, and he still likes Cartozia Tales, which is really flattering and fun. But I think it takes a little longer to read each page for sure than a page of, say, Johnny Boo.
So how did the idea of Cartozia Tales come up?
Oh, it's complicated. So it was several different threads that kind of came together. The first thing I think is that at some point when Mike and I were drawing Satisfactory comics and doing a lot of experiments with jams and other sorts of collaboration, I had been reading this. I read this Dylan Horrocks essay called "The Perfect Planet" that is about video games and role-playing games and comics and sort of the possibilities for storytelling in a non-linear or non-narrative mode. I had to fill in. I mean, you should, if you haven't read it, it's a really interesting essay. But one of the things that he points out in the essay is that, you look at the map of a D&D module, it represents all this narrative potential. There are all these different places that players may or may not go. And while you're reading the module and reading the map, there's this sort of rich, multi-narrative potential story there. And that applies also to the sort of world maps that come into fantasy books like the Oz books or Lord of the Rings. You see parts of the world in those maps that never get narrated. And so while Mike and I were drawing Satisfactory comics, I had the idea that it would be fun to use a map to kind of coordinate or regulate a jam where everybody was contributing in a different part of the world. And that sort of shuffling of cartoonists from one part of the world to another was part of that original experiment. And that was fun. We called it Map Jam, and Mike and I each drew stories. Tom Motley, who's in Cartozia Tales with us now, also contributed to it. Damian J. did stories for it. Tom Kaczynski did a story. It was just us and some of our friends kind of filling out this really haphazard and silly world. It didn't really cohere, and it was fun to draw, and I could see that it was going to do something interesting, but it also turned out that none of us really had time to make it work. So it ran through 2 issues and then kind of collapsed in on itself. But I held on to that as a process, and then several years later, I was talking with Sarah Beacon at an SPX and thinking about how fun it would be to make a fantasy world that kids could that could be comics for kids, all ages comics that kids could really enter into. Because one of the really important experiences for me as a kid and was kind of entering into these imaginary worlds and really investing a lot of imagination and attention into worlds that were made up. And I wanted to make one up because I thought it would be fun. And I thought it would be really fun to be able to invite some of the cartoonists I know into that world also. And as I was talking to Sarah and thinking about the old Map Jam idea and thinking about the idea of doing comics for kids, these things all kind of clicked together for me. Also, along with some thinking about how, do you know the Trondheim and Svar series called Dungeon, Derek?
Yes.
Yeah, so I love that series, and every time I read any of Dungeon, I just immediately want to go make some of it myself. It's such a rich world, and I want to participate in it. And that feeling mixed in with some of those other thoughts got me thinking at SPX about, well, what if we made an all ages comic that had this kind of complex shared map collaborative process in it, and I kind of tried to get Sarah and Mike to talk me out of it. Do you remember it that way, Mike? I was saying, this is going to be a lot of work. This is going to be really hard. There would have to be a Kickstarter. We would need a lot of subscribers. It would be really difficult. Try to get me not to do this. And I couldn't let go of it. It just seemed like too good of an idea. And I have to admit, it's turned out better than I thought it would. It's totally satisfied everything that I'd hoped for.
But it's also been at least as much work as you feared, yes?
Oh, more. Yeah, it's been a lot harder than I thought it would too. But the payout. I love the characters. I love the setting. Mike, you can chip in on this if you want, but I feel like there's a kind of Cartozia feel or flavor that I recognize. And it just seems like, okay, this belongs in Cartozia. That wouldn't fit, and it's not something that's coming directly from me, but it's like this hybridization of all of the different authors who've worked on it, all the different cartoonists, there's some flavor that's coming from Sarah Beacon and some that's coming from Sean Chang and some that's coming from Loopy and some that's coming from me and Mike. And, there's this little thread of James Kachalka-ness that's running through the whole thing and so forth, because everybody's had their fingerprints on it. And the thing that we've made together has its own identity now, which is really neat. It's kind of, this collaborative thing that's in between us rather than being rather than belonging to any one of us.
Yeah, in a strange sense, it's kind of an anthology book, right? In that every issue has 9 separate stories. But in as much as all of those stories cumulatively over the run of the comic are getting contributions from the same creators at different times, I think it is adding up to a series that has a kind of tonal consistency to it, even as it's constantly getting new ideas and weird approaches injected into it from the various guest artists that come and visit, or from what happens when you have the sensibility of a Tom Motley that is thrown up against the sensibility of a Jen Vaughn. It's not an obvious combination, but it has produced, I think, a distinctive result.
And one of the things I've noticed that with each successive issue, if we want to call them the credits at the bottom of each tale seem to be getting longer and longer, where one artist and or writer is building upon what another creator has done or suggested or originated. And so, you guys definitely give credit where credit is due. And so the more people who work on a particular storyline with certain characters, settings, and whatnot, the longer the credits section becomes at the bottom of each story.
Yeah, you can have a 3-page story that has like 2 lines of credits at the bottom of the first page, where it's just saying, all of these characters were invented by different people, and here are the people who invented them. I really like that about it. I actually have to remind our guests to do that frequently, because they're not used to they're not used to giving explicit credit for, this place was suggested by this person. But I like that about it. I like the idea that somebody can pick up an issue and kind of trace the origins of each one of these ideas. But really, by this point, the characters are I mean, like, for instance, Mike and I are working on a story for issue 9 right now that features Minig, who is a character that we drew for the very first issue also. She's moved from one place of the map to another. She's how do we explain Minig? She's a sort of early teenaged otter girl. She's like she's a half-breed, half human and half belonging to this undersea civilization that outsiders refer to as the otter folk. And so she's been sort of struggling her way across the continent trying to find her dad. And, technically we get credit for creating her, but her personality and her plot and her, thematic issues are really not mostly put in action by us. I mean, I think the personality is still recognizable from issue 1, but the things that have happened to her have conditioned her, and she's maybe the most consistent of the characters in the book in some ways. Most of the other ones have really been defined gradually as several different people work on each story, and so the credits are a lie, Derek. They're true, but they're also a lie.
Well, you were mentioning that character. One that we're introduced to very early, in fact, the very first page of the very first issue, is Shreya. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Yeah.
Yeah. And she's someone who, like about all the other characters, we see crop up again and again. But the reason I wanted to mention Shreya is she seems to me to be something like, I guess, the host of Cartozia Tales, that she pops in every now and again and explains a region or describes what a particular location looks like. And many times she'll sometimes literally look right at the reader and explain what's going on. And in a way, it's like, oh, let me show you here. This is some place that you may need to know or find interesting, or this is a situation that I'm going to describe to you. So is she like the host of Cartozia?
Yeah, she's sort of a narrator figure.
She's like the crypt keeper.
I was wondering about that. A little less scary.
Yeah. What I would say about her, though, is although that's a pretty good description of the way she's tended to be deployed in the comic, she actually does have a bit of a backstory. There was a pretty extensive exchange of notes and ideas behind the scenes, even prior to the first issue, in which Sarah Beacon first proposed the character, designed her, and started to get ideas about what her backstory might actually be. And so I quite liked in issue 6 when Shreya sort of stepped out of her role as a host to be a character in the story Fortune Favors the Brave, which was by Sarah and her sister Becky Gautreaux. And to some extent, that backstory filtered into the comic at that moment. And I should say, apropos of that there's a lot of ancillary Cartozia material that may never see the light of day in the pages of the book. But that's not to say that it doesn't, in some intangible way, inform the way that we do deploy the characters or think about what kind of work they're doing as we draw them or write them.
Well, that sounds very similar to something that, Isaac, you mentioned earlier about those undiscovered places on the map that we don't know of yet. So in a narrative sense, there are undiscovered regions that we may not even see in Cartozia Tales. Yeah,
absolutely. There will always be some part that's not described, and there will always be a character that we don't know as well as we might. We try to actually make that explicit because I think it's a lesson that is worth it's a good lesson for kids to take in, the idea that like your life and your experience, that the other people you meet, they have full lives also. And you won't know all of their background because you only meet this person when they're working the checkout line at the grocery store for you. But if you lived in their life, you would know all this stuff about them. We try in Cartozia Tales. I mean, that's actually something that I'm thinking about as I think about our imperative to like populate the map. But we also try to foreground the fact that no matter how much we populate it, the closer you look at any part of the map, the more detail there is, the more people's stories there are, the more there is to get to know. So, when you're reading a fantasy novel, you want to have the feeling that there's more, that the characters know more about the world than you do. And that there's more that you could find out if you could look around the corner or if you could wind time back a little bit. That's a good feeling to have as a reader. I like to think of it also as having this kind of vaguely, maybe calling it an ethical component is too strong, but this sort of like this idea that in fact the world is full of stories that you won't completely know because they're not your own story.
Yeah, there's a kind of totalizing desire in wanting to know everything that can feel kind of oppressive if taken too far. And at the same time, the imaginative potential of things that are unexplained or mysterious is often a lot more attractive than having too many things spelled out on the nose. I'm thinking of some parallels from film. I remember, Isaac, when you were thinking through your response to Mad Max Fury Road.
Oh, yeah.
You were saying that there were all these little details that stayed in your mind for days afterward because they were visible on the screen. They weren't necessarily explained or dwelled on.
Right, like the dude that's like walking around on 4 stilts in the water, the muddy part of the wasteland where the trees used to be. And he passes by in the foreground. He's just there for a little bit, and you're like, "Well, why is he on stilts? What's going on? What?" But there's no explanation. You just know that if the camera could slow down, if the story could dwell on this guy, you could get exposition. He would make sense, but he's just part of a world that's full of things that you're not going to see completely. Why does a little lizard at the beginning have 2 heads? I don't know.
Yeah. And by the same token, if you explain too many things, it can really deaden the interest of story. And to take an example from other film, right? So think about what happened to the Force when George Lucas decided to biologize it as midichlorians. I don't think that really helped the appeal of the Force for many viewers.
And so there are a lot of stories and a lot of characters that ultimately we may not know much, if anything, about, which I think is great. But with along with that, something that I've noticed that has started to come together with each issue, successive issue, is that these different storylines are starting to come together to create a larger narrative. And that's something that I really appreciate. I mean, it's one thing to have characters who we keep coming back to, represented by different creators, which is great. But then when you have these different storylines starting to interweave one with the other, where characters from one start to interact and then become central with characters in another, I mean, you definitely are teasing out a larger narrative space.
Yeah, I'm not sure to what extent that was an accident when it started to happen, and to what extent it's built into the design. I think because we've got the same cartoonists working from one issue to the next, it's really natural for each of us to want to try to connect the stuff we do in one issue to something we've done in a previous issue, even though we're geographically far from the stories we've told. Mm-hmm. And I think when Sean Cheng was working on, I think it was a second issue, he wanted to hook in the story he was telling, which was set in this sort of, I think it's called something like a mother wood. It's a really old forest that has mother trees in it, and in fact, it turns out later even a grandmother tree. But it's sick, and there's something wrong with it, and that was established by John Lewis, not the congressman, but John Lewis, the cartoonist.
Both comics makers.
Yeah, but John Lewis, the cartoonist who drew True Swamp, he's in our first issue, and he established that there was something sick in these woods. Meanwhile, in the first issue, Sean had made offhand reference to a miasma in his story, and so when he did in the second issue, his story set in those mother woods, he made the bad thing that was affecting them be called the miasma, which connected that story to then the story he had been telling in the first issue. And by connecting those two stories together, he kind of set the stage for us to connect other things into that plot. And so that's one of the things that we've been sort of hooking things onto as we continue. And it's come to seem really important. I think that as we get closer to issues 9 and 10, which are going to conclude the run, this is obviously one of the things that we have to actually conclude. We have to tell an ending to the story of the miasma. There are definitely going to be stories in the book that are important stories that never directly connect to that overarching plot. I don't think that Minig needs to be, for example, involved in solving the problem of the miasma, although she will, by issue 9, have played a small role in affecting. She will have played a role in affecting one part of. Man, I don't want to give anything away, but she's going to be connected in a kind of trivial way to the larger plot, or maybe it'll turn out not to have been trivial. That's probably not going to be up to me. And I think that Sylvia, who has been sort of trying to avoid becoming the war child of New Zedney, or just Zedney, the war child of Zedney, she's probably not going to have anything to do with that overarching plot, but she's been in every issue so far.
Huh.
So
you mentioned the coming together of some of these stories may have occurred almost by accident.
Yeah.
And that leads me to another question. Which came first, the story or storylines or the actual map of Cartozia?
The map. The map came first. The map was part of us figuring out what we were going to have in common as we got ready to draw. And in fact, there was a kind of round of collaborative preparation that happened before anything got drawn. We spent a lot of time with just like shared documents on Google, sharing ideas for creatures and for characters and for place names. And that was everybody who was involved in the first issue, or everybody who, I think Adam Koford, who's in the second issue, also gave us a few creature designs just because he can doodle up a creature very quickly. And a few other people's stuff, we kind of borrowed some other things by permission. And once we had everything shared, I had a list of place names, and I drew some continents that looked like they made sense to me and would still have something interesting in each sector of the map. And I put all the place names onto the map, all the place names we had, and it looks pretty crummy compared to the map that we have now that Sarah drew. But I shared that around so that everybody would know what was where, and then we took numbers out of a hat. I mean, not literally a hat, but I put the numbers on slips of paper and assigned them at random to everybody for the first issue. Nobody knew where they would be until they got ready to draw. And we had a sense of what was where and what kind of creatures existed in Cartozia before we did any drawing or writing.
So all of the landscape, for instance, Ringwood, the Round Robin, the Observatory, Shrinking Swamp, all of that was laid out, and then you started the stories.
Yeah, I mean, the things were named. In many cases, we didn't know much more than a name.
Sometimes there were descriptions attached, and some of the descriptions implied a kind of story. So, for example, there's this element on the map called the footprint, and there are theories about what might have accounted for the footprint. Or Mead Hall X has some ideas attached to it, but none of those was decisive in any way, unless or until it entered a story that someone chose to write down.
Once it's printed, it's canon, but until then, it's a suggestion.
And in a sense, starting from the map to generate the stories makes this just a variation on any of the other kind of formally constrained approaches to comics that Isaac and I and others have long been interested in. It's just a different kind of formal constraint, one that I think is pretty wide open. But the priority of the map to the stories is kind of analogous, not to compare unlike things, to the way that, say, Tolkien started with words, vocabulary, and invented languages, and only afterward created narrative to sort of account for the development of these languages that he was inventing.
Now, see, I thought where you were going to go with that, Mike, was not Tolkien, but like Marvel Comics, the way that there's a universe that exists before you start telling your story there, Like if you wanted to set a story with new characters in the Marvel continuity, you would have rules. You would know stuff about the world, and you would know stuff about what aliens exist, and you would know stuff about, what sorts of things have happened in the history. And in a way, having us all just talk out having us build the map before we started drawing was basically establishing some rules for continuity, except that they were really not rules. They were more like suggestions.
Yeah.
And there are actually some places on the map that we still don't really know anything about. Like there's a place called the Hushing Well. I don't know what that is. I think there's a reference to it in one of our Halloween comics as having fresh air. That's about it.
Well, it sounds cool.
Yeah, it's a neat name, but it's not the neatest place in that part of the map, so we haven't said anything there. And I think probably nothing will happen there. It's just going to be a feature on the map. And actually, since the Kickstarter, we've done a couple of different versions of the map that have included like the names of backers as place names and things like that. So there's some places on the map that are in there just to sort of tip the hat to somebody who has supported us. And every time Mike and I draw a story where we can include a new map, we'll often, there's the world map, and we'll often have an inset panel in one story or another where you see detailed maps that have many more things on them. And whenever we do that, we try to include a little hat tip to somebody. I'm trying to think. There was a. Do you want to say what, Mike?
Children's artists in the recent story, right? Like Bill Peet, Beatrix Potter, Dr. Seuss. They all.
Yeah, we did some little tributes in the most recent one where we sort of ciphered or rearranged the sounds of famous kids book illustrators just for fun into the map.
Can I share my favorites?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in one of our issues, we had a sort of inset detail of a map page in the area called the Brunberg, and on a stretch of coastline, I wanted to call one area the Bay of Threes, and a beach is called Ordizzi Beach, and Bay of Threes is basically a hat tip to Penny Century,
right.
Beatriz. from Jaime Hernandez, and Ordizzi Beach is just Isidro's Beach backwards. So that's for Gilbert Hernandez.
Huh. And we should also mention that at the beginning of every issue, I guess what we could call a table of contents, there is your map and the story that is in the particular issue, along with the creators' names. There's a link to where on the map this takes place.
Yeah, every since the first issue, every table of contents has been a new map with a key that basically says, here's where you could find the stories. Those are fun to produce. I'm going to have to work hard to do the next one because I'm learning new software as an alternative to Photoshop because I switched computers and my new one won't run my 12-year-old copy of Photoshop CS anymore. So I'm dreading learning. I'm dreading the learning curve, but it'll be fun to do a new one. We've tried to do those maps so that the coloring, the line work on the map, Mike did for issue number 2, and it's been the same every time. But we've done the coloring by a different method each time. So one of them has flat digital colors. One of them is like a Photoshop collage of different scans of paper. So it's like a virtual paper collage. And then Loopy did a virtual fabric collage using a similar method. I think Mike did a crayon version one time, or maybe I did a crayon and you did colored pencil. I can't remember.
Right. Yeah.
But I try to add a little, it's just an extra little layer of work.
Because more work makes better comics, right, Isaac?
More work makes better comics. I actually think there's something to be said for that. And this is a joke that Mike and I have been making to each other probably since 2002. That, every time we think we're going to get away with doing something easy, we wind up making it more complicated for ourselves. And we actually did a promo postcard for Satisfactory Comics one time that had these fake reviews being spoken by a bunch of different people saying things like, they're getting a lot better, or, I can see that you put a lot of work into this page. And one of them is this little old lady who says, they're always finding new ways to make things more difficult for themselves. But I actually think that if you look at a comics page and you can see visually from glancing at it that a lot of drawing work went into it. If you're looking at a page from a Joe Sacco comic that's like heavily cross-hatched, or if you're looking at a page of like something by Anders Nilsson that's got a whole lot of small lines to create texture, you can detect that work, and I think it makes you actually take the page in a little bit more slowly. You linger on it a little more. And that's helpful for us because we're trying to build a book that that takes a little while to read. A 40-page issue of Satisfactory Comics is supposed to be the sort of thing you can't read in one sitting. I'm sorry, not Satisfactory Comics. I mean Cartozia Tales. A 40-page issue of Cartozia Tales is supposed to be the sort of thing that you can't read in one sitting. That you're going to set it down and come back to it, or revisit one of the stories later. Because it costs the same to print 40 pages of really dense storytelling as it does to print 40 pages of really loose, spacious storytelling, and you get more bang for your buck as a reader if it takes a little while longer to read.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of times Satisfactory Comics, and I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that, and then how the transition has been from the two of you working together on Satisfactory Comics into something with many more moving parts.
Well,
do you want to start this off, Mike?
Sure. From the very beginning, Satisfactory Comics has been a way not only for Isaac and me to try our own hand at comics making, but to involve a lot of other people, right? The first issue of Satisfactory Comics was a 16-page story that ended up having contributions from 17 other friends of ours, in part because we couldn't count. It was supposed to be one panel per page that was donated by friends. But from the beginning, we have made one of the ways that we complicate things for ourselves be the contributions of other persons who may or may not be cartoonists themselves. We have had stories that have begun with suggestions from fellow grad students, from poets, from more fine artists than cartoonists. And one of the things that we tried to do with Satisfactory Comics was find different ways of generating narrative with each issue. So we were adding constraints, we were taking some constraints away, we were also each growing as cartoonists in our own separate ways. I mean, initially, I would say that most of the dialoguing and inking was done by Isaac, and most of the penciling was done by me. Over our years of collaboration, we've each taken on more of all the roles involved in being a more complete cartoonist. And I think it has helped that in the process of working with all these other minds and other interests, that we have been pushed to think of scenarios and to draw things that maybe we wouldn't have thought of on our own, or maybe wouldn't have chosen to draw on our own. I certainly feel that way when I have to draw any interior that has a lot of complicated perspective in it. And there too, I'm grateful that Isaac is there to do digital fixes when necessary in a recent issue.
The way you describe Satisfactory Comics makes me want to go back and look at them again or reread them. We haven't made a new issue of Satisfactory Comics for, I don't know, 8 years?
Yeah.
Something like that. It's been a while.
It's going to be 8, yeah.
Yeah, so there was a project sort of from long ago, but probably the easiest way to describe it is that it's just a bunch of mini comics that Mike and I made as we were kind of learning what it would mean to make comics that had told stories in a kind of sustained way, and where we were trying out various sorts of narrative making experimental methods. They don't. I hope they don't read like they were made as the product of experiments, but every one of them began with some sort of strange, let's collect up a bunch of different nouns from our friends, and we've got to make sure that we have every one of those nouns in this story, or something along those lines. They're a lot of them they're kind of clumsy. We look back. I think we look back on them and kind of wince at some of it, and some of it is pretty good. There are definitely parts where I feel still a little proud. I'm not sure whether there's any issue that is like I'm uniformly proud of, except for the very last issue, which is not really an issue. It's a set of 10 postcards that have a story serialized on them. That one still holds up really well, I think. But by then we had really started figuring out better how to make comics, and also how to make comics each individually. I mean, we've been collaborating together since 2001. That was when we drew our first comic together, and we've been consistently working together. Now that we live in different cities, we have to collaborate by a variety of different methods instead of just like handing the pages off to each other. Although sometimes we do that. But often we pass stuff back and forth digitally, and we've because we're working in different cities, we're starting to kind of fill in more of the roles, I think, and that it helps to have a lot of other friends in the collaboration as well. And one of the cool things about working on Cartozia Tales now, after having worked on Satisfactory Comics with Mike, is we developed a kind of philosophy of collaborative art making while we were working on Satisfactory Comics. And I mean, I say we developed a kind of philosophy. We even wrote up a little booklet that was called something like, well, the short title is A Treatise Upon the Jam, or A Treatise on the Jam, but there's a longer title that I don't have access to, or I don't have it at my fingertips right now. It has a sort of long 18th century style title. But in that one, it's just a sort of a Socratic dialogue with me and Mike and this unnamed interlocutor walking along and talking about why we would choose to make art together instead of doing it individually. And the whole idea of, I think I kind of alluded to this earlier talking about Cartozia Tales, that as you as you build something collaboratively, it starts to be a thing that is not in either of you, but is somehow between you. Or if you're working with a large group and it goes well, you know, the thing you make is it's owned by everyone and it's owned by nobody, because everything in it has been handled by the whole group, but nobody's responsible completely for any one part. And that for us has always meant making something better than we would have made on our own. Mostly because both Mike and I really trust the other guy to edit when we need to, you know. We're really good at making suggestions for the other guy, and also at closing down things that maybe aren't the best judgment, you know.
Yeah.
And between those two aspects of editorial work, we wind up pushing the other guy to make better comics a lot. You know, even if it's just a question of like, okay, well, you need to draw more people in this crowd scene, or, you know, you drew that table. I'm thinking of the same thing Mike was mentioning a little while ago. There's a large panel in one of our stories in issue 7, where or our story in issue 7 of Cartozia Tales. There's a panel where he had initially drawn the perspective just really off, so that
one aspect of the whole scene.
Yeah, a lot of it was really perfect, but there was a table that was set in there so that it looked like it was about a foot off of the ground instead of about 4 feet off the ground, or 3 feet.
It was very wrong. Yeah.
And so I had to get into Photoshop and like move the surface of the table around as a polygon and redraw some parts of it, and I made it look okay. I think when I look at it, I still don't feel totally satisfied, because I wasn't using perspective science to fix it. I was just, you know, kind of eyeballing it and doing the best I could.
For what it's worth, I have the full title of the treatise on the jam, if you would like me to read it into the record.
Sure.
All right. It's a treatise upon the jam, being a dialogue in the Socratic style, and the author is an unnamed interlocutor concerning collaborative approaches to art in pictorial narrative and otherwise.
And I think picture words like otherwise as having the long S, the sort of F-shaped S, you know.
And what else would one expect from a PhD making comics?
2 PhDs making comics.
Exactly, yeah. So an extra long title.
Yeah, although actually, neither of us had our PhDs at the point when we made that, but you know,
you were aspiring,
and neither of us worked in 18th century studies.
Now, you mentioned that Cartozia Tales will end after issue 10. Do you have any plans to go back to Satisfactory Comics after you finish up Cartozia Tales, or just another collaborative project completely different?
I don't know. We haven't talked about what Mike and I are going to do next. I'm sure we'll keep drawing comics, but I don't know what.
I'm like halfway through the longest 24-hour comic ever, which I had intended it to be part my contribution to Satisfactory Comics 9, which we had thought of as being basically cover stories in which we would each take a comic that meant a lot to us and sort of do a redrawn version of it with enough material change to make it, you know, not a total actionable ripoff. I've done 11 pages out of 24, and I've been timing them. You know, each page has taken an hour or less to do, but I think I started 3 years ago. So by the time it's finished, assuming I ever finish it, I want it to be a legit 24-hour comic in terms of the time spent on it, but it will have stretched over probably the better part of a decade.
I don't know what I would do if I were asked to make something like that, but I suppose that I could probably pry 24 hours free sometime to make a second half of that issue. But I don't know. I did a project recently, or started a project recently that I called Draw 2 Panels. That some of it ran on the Okey Panky website. They're a literary magazine, an online literary magazine, and I have more pages of it that are in a mini. I might do some more of that or some more stuff like it. Honestly, I think after we are done drawing and telling stories for Cartozia Tales, I'm going to be so busy trying to shape it into something like book form for a while that I probably won't take on new significant drawing for a while. And I may, after that, actually want to go back and work on a book or something, like actual academic writing instead of cartooning. I'm not sure. It's hard for me to see that far in the future, because right now everything in the next 2 weeks has cluttered up my brain so much that I don't know what's happening in 2 years.
So now, did you guys know from the very beginning that you would only have 10 issues of Cartozia Tales?
Yeah, that was always the plan. I think when we were first starting off, we talked very freely about the idea of there being a second volume. And now I know that if I started planning a second volume, I would catch a lot of flack from parts of my life that don't involve making comics, because it's just been such a huge investment of time. I can't really describe to you. I mean, it's hard to make it clear. It's actually had a impact on my health, hopefully not long term, but putting out Cartozia Tales means skipping a lot of sleep, and it's kind of run me down to the point where I really I can see that I really can't afford to take on another project quite this big without spending a little time focusing more on just like getting myself healthy again, and maybe spending a little more time on my teaching and other things that are sort of getting backburnered and shelved temporarily. But I also really would like to see more happen with the world of Cartozia. I've talked occasionally with some of the core cartoonists about having like sequel books that had more sustained storytelling, but in the same world, maybe not with the same characters. I've got a kind of fun idea for a kid's book that we might try to do that Mike and I could write. I don't know if Mike, I haven't talked to you about it in months, so it's still sort of a vague idea.
Backpack idea with Sean?
Yeah, the like backpack means adventure story. Yeah. But there's some other things floating around. It's going to kind of depend on what people want to publish. One thing that I'm learning from this is that although I actually personally enjoy stuffing envelopes, I don't really enjoy running a publishing house. There are aspects about the marketing that I find really difficult, and I really would like to see Cartozia Tales become something that you could put in a public library. Like, I'd like to see it have a spine. I don't think it's going to all be one volume, because it would be like 400 pages of very dense comics. If you just bound up everything we've made, it would actually be more than 400 pages, and it would be quite dense. You can imagine, Derek, what it would be like to try to sit down and read it all in one sitting.
Oh, yeah.
But I would like to get it into book form. I would really prefer not to have to do that myself as a self-publisher, just because I don't have enough room in my basement for all of the copies of the book that I would need to print, and I don't really want to have to compose a ton of marketing emails and, all of those things that you do when you're running a Kickstarter campaign that involve trying to get people interested and trying to get people to buy the book. I mean, I like talking about it. I like taking it to conventions. I really like interacting with people who are either readers or about to become readers, but the time it takes on social media to like try to drum up new interest, and it just kills me. I mean, maybe I'm being over dramatic about it, but I sustaining that level of like of optimism about how people are going to react to something and whether something's going to catch fire, it's kind of hard. And I think personally, like my personality is just not predisposed in that direction. I'm good at coming up with big ideas, but I'm not really good at hyping them, if that makes sense.
Well, have you considered the possibility of taking the completed Cartozia Tales to a publisher to actually put into hardbound, or at least book form? I have talked to a couple of people. I will continue to talk to other people. I've got some plans. I don't have any
I don't have anything that I sure don't have anything I could share as news, and I don't really have anything firm. But I know some people that I should talk to, and I think that once it's all finished, many publishers are leery about publishing anthologies because the rights for royalties and things like that are just a huge headache. But I'd need to iron out all of that legal stuff before I took it to a publisher, and I know that, and I actually don't think that will be hard for me to do. But I just need to make sure everybody's got it understood and explicit. And I think that we need to have the book pretty much finished before we take it to anybody. But it is almost finished. I mean, probably by the summer we'll have it all in the can. I think I would really like to see it come out from a good publisher, but it's going to take me a little while to make it into the thing that it needs to be. Thinking about how it would look as a single volume makes me realize that Cartozia Tales needs to be a multi-volume thing, even if the volumes are kind of slim. Mm-hmm. And even just having, 80 pages of Cartozia Tales between two covers would feel kind of dense. And it would benefit it to have some smaller spacers in between the stories. Huh?
Entracts.
Right. Yeah, like little something to cleanse the palate. And so probably when we get ready to turn it into a book, I'll have to get some other smaller things to put in there too. That's actually one of the things I intend to do with the new material that's being drawn for the second edition of the first issue. Those stories. Most of those stories that are being drawn now by new guest cartoonists, they don't need to be they don't need to be chronologically in the first issue in order to work. So I could stick them in between two stories in issue number 2 or number 3, and they would still read fine.
So when can we expect issue number 10 to be out?
I think probably number 10 will be out. I mean, it'll certainly be out in time for most of the summer conventions. I think it's going to depend on how soon issue 9 comes together. I had thought that all the stories for issue 9 would be mostly done by now, actually, but we're still pretty far back on most of them. And I've got to get issue number 1, the reprint of it, to the printers before then, I think. That one will come together more quickly. The short version of the answer is that, it'll probably be by the summer, but I'm not 100% sure. It's just kind of, you got to imagine that you're asking a dissertation advisee, so when are you going to have this chapter finished? And all I can really say is, blood from a stone, buddy. It's going to be done when it's done. We're working on it every day, but not working on it all day every day. And hopefully it'll come together soon. I'm excited to see what happens in the next couple of issues, though. Things have really there's a lot going on in the story, and I want to see what happens with the miasma. I don't have anything to do with it in this issue, so I'm really anxious about where that plot is going. I want to see what happens with Sylvia. I want to see what happens with Minig, although I think her story is going to mostly be wrapped up by the end of issue 9, and I'm pretty happy with the way that it's wrapping up.
Well, that leads me to a question. You said that you're looking forward to seeing how some of these stories unfold. Does the trajectory of the various storylines, is that completely in the hand of the artist who's working on it at that point, or do you give people any suggestions of where to go or what they should consider?
The answer is mostly, as an editor, I let people do what they want to do, especially the core group of cartoonists. They have their own say about what happens next. In the sector of the map that they're working on, they can choose to continue the story that's been told there so far. They can choose to come up with something new. They can turn things around in a weird reversal if they want to. All those things are possible. And I have exerted very, very little control over the stories. I have made suggestions from time to time, especially with guest cartoonists. I'll say stuff like, oh, well, one way that you could tie this in with other stories is by using this character in the background. Or you could, I think in issue 8, we had a character who Mike and I had planned a story and were drawing a story where the character had made it all the way across the continent from where he was in the previous issue. And then we got a story I got pencils from Maris Wicks of another story featuring that character in a different place. And so we had to kind of sort out how he was going to make that transition from one place to another. And part of that involved me saying to Sean Cheng, like, Sean, your story happens in between Maris's and the one Mike and I are doing. Could you put Hubert flying overhead in the sky in one panel? Nobody has to notice him, but we need him to cross over your territory. And so if you look, there's a large panel in the middle of the comic where this character, who's a main character in 2 of the stories on either side of Sean's story, you can see him in the air flying overhead, not noticed by anyone else because other dramatic things are happening. But it was just so, like, I make little suggestions along those lines, but I've never tried to control where the stories are going unless it's a question of stories happening simultaneously that need to where there needs to be some coherence to them. The stuff that's going on with Minig in issue 9 is involving a lot of like back and forth talk because Sarah Beacon and her sister Becky got their story done first, but theirs is the third one in the sequence of stories that involves Minig in this issue. So Mike and I know where she's got to wind up right before that story, and we're kind of incorporating her ideas in our story. But we needed to all have a kind of consensus about the big reveal, which is who is Minig's dad. There's been a lot of back and forth in the book about whether this adventurer, Gavin Ashbrook, who's traveling with her, is really her dad or not. And that's going to be revealed in this issue. The whole story is going to be explained. And Sarah and Becky really got to call the shots on the answer to that big question because it was in their story that the revelation was going to happen. But Mike and I needed to know what the answer to the revelation was because the Ashbrook and Minig are talking to each other in our story, and we have to have the dialogue reflect what's going to be revealed later on. You see?
So, you as you've mentioned, you have guest creators in every issue. What guest creators can we expect in issue 9 and then the final issue of Cartozia Tales?
Nick Abadzis and Tom Hart are both joining us in issue 9. And issue 10 is going to have a story, if all goes well. I mean, I haven't started advertising issue 10 yet, so this isn't 100% official. But Lark Pine is going to draw a story for us. And the last time I talked to her, I think it's okay for me to say this, Carla Speed McNeil wants to draw a story for issue 10. And either she's going to be drawing it herself or either she's going to be writing it herself or we may get somebody to collaborate with her. That's still sort of up in the air, but that's who we've got on deck. And there will also probably be some other ancillary small stuff coming from other people that we haven't, that we can't, that I can't tell you right now because I'm not 100% sure about it.
Okay. Now, as we mentioned earlier in the interview, both of you are also educators. So, outside of Cartozia Tales, how do you, or maybe even with Cartozia Tales, how do you bring comics into your classrooms?
Well, I have the distinct pleasure of teaching at a high school that already included comics in their curriculum before I got here. So I teach 10th and 12th grade English at Georgetown Day School in Washington, D.C. And the 10th grade curriculum has featured Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. It had featured it for some time before I got here. So it was very easy for me to step into that. I began my senior English class with City of Glass, the graphic novel, adaptation of Paul Auster's novella by Paul Karasik and David Mazzucchelli. And for the past 2 years, I got to teach a year-long seminar on basically comics as literature, which also featured a creative component such that all of the students did cartooning. Last year we produced a mini comic showcasing the projects that students had done in the first semester, and that was very gratifying. This year that course isn't running, but some of the alumni from the course have teamed up with friends of theirs to create a cartooning club, which meets once a week, and that's a great opportunity for people to trade notes and to look at things that they're drawing together, to work on technique, to share stories, and so I've been very happy at the opportunities that I've had, even in a high school setting, to incorporate comics pretty freely. I've even taught a couple of comics to audiences of parents. We have a parent book group, and I led discussions of City of Glass and Fun Home with them over the last few years. They've been very receptive and have recognized a lot of the literary potential and literary achievement of this form.
And, I teach at the University of Vermont, and I actually have been lucky enough to teach full semester courses on the graphic novel for kind of a long time now. I think actually this is the third or fourth job in which I've taught graphic novel pretty regularly. And I think I haven't actually done the math, but I think I've actually taught graphic novel on average, more than once a year since the fall of 2001. I teach a lot of sections of it now. So I have a full semester long course on the graphic novel. And while I'm teaching that class, I think probably the longer I work on that class, the more my work as an editor and a cartoonist has started to inform the kinds of things that I tell the students about. Like I get them trying to pay attention to decisions that the cartoonist is making to make the story work at this stage or the other. So I don't tell them this at first because it's a course for non-majors, but I'm basically teaching them close reading by teaching them how to think like a cartoonist while they're reading the comics. Why does Spiegelman include this detail in this panel? Could he have cropped this in a way that excludes that detail? Those sorts of questions. And that class for me is more a kind of introduction to serious comics than it is a history class as such. Sometimes I think that the course would work better if I had 2 semesters and could do one semester for history and another semester for sort of the last 10 years or the last 5 years, really give them some new and interesting stuff. But I don't foresee having a 2-semester sequence of graphic novel anytime really soon. Maybe later, if I have more institutional security, I'll try it out. I've also been talking idly with people at UVM about maybe teaching a course on making comics as a creative writing class from time to time. We haven't done that yet. I haven't done that yet, but another of my colleagues, a cartoonist named Glynis Fox, who is the wife of somebody in classics, she has taught a couple of comics making classes at UVM. So we've got the talent necessary to put together a curriculum in comics at UVM, but we just haven't tried to kind of gather the institution around it yet. It would actually be, Alison Bechdel is actually formally affiliated with the university. She doesn't do any teaching. She does like day-long workshops and stuff like that from time to time, but she has a regular gig here. And Kachalka, who we've talked about before, he lives here in town, and he'd be happy to do stuff with us too. And I don't know. I could talk on and on about this comics studies center that doesn't exist, but that's probably not the best way to use the interview.
Yeah.
Anyway, I do spend a lot of my classroom time on teaching comics and how they work, but not all. I also teach writing classes, and sometimes I teach classes on poetry, which is what my graduate training is in. So,
Well, now, we've been talking about Cartozia comics as people could just go out to their local shops and pick up a copy, but unfortunately that's not the case. So where can our listeners find out more about Cartozia Tales?
Well, if you can spell Cartozia, then you can punch it into Google, and the first thing that'll come up is our website. We actually deliberately picked a name that was easy to spell from hearing it, and also didn't have other things out there already on the internet. Like we have Cartozia.com. So you can go to Cartozia.com and you can order up individual issues, or you can order up I think I'm calling it a 10-issue bundle now instead of subscription, because most of the issues exist. But you can order all 10 of them. They're cheaper if you get them that way. You can also order them digitally. If you'd like to read PDFs on a tablet, we have PDFs, and you can get those directly from our website. Those are the best ways. There are a few comic shops that carry Cartozia Tales, but the printing is actually expensive enough that I can't afford to sell them to comic shops that want more than about 30% commission, because printing and shipping are expensive. And that print you have, I think you have the digital copies, but the book is actually on really nice paper. So the reason why it costs a lot to print and ship is because we're printing it so that it can stay on your bookshelf for a long time. It doesn't feel like a floppy comic book in your hands. It feels like a chapbook, like something that's going to stay. Like each individual issue has this sort of chapbook feel.
So Cartozia.com is where people can find
that's
more
the short
and
answer.
get copies.
Cartozia.com.
Okay. Well, Isaac and then Mike, I want to thank the both of you for being on the Comics Alternative and for telling us about Cartozia Tales. Good luck with the wrap-up, and I hope we can see a single or multi-volume collection of Cartozia Tales in the not-too-distant future.
Knock wood. I hope it happens. Thanks for having us, Derek.
Much obliged. Thank you.
That was a really nice conversation with Mike and Isaac. I want to thank them again for taking the time to be on the Comics Alternative. If you want to find out more about Cartozia Tales, go to the website that they mentioned, Cartozia.com. That's Cartozia. It's a great comic, and I look forward to these final 2 issues. You know where else you can find really good comics? At our sponsor's website, of course, Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to their site, dcbservice.com, you're going to find some incredible specials. You can also find great deals at our other sponsor's website, that is Just Coffee Co-op. If you go to justcoffee.coop, look at all of the different coffees they have, and when you check out, be sure to use our coupon code COMICS. That's COMICS for 10% off of your order. And as you're waiting for your coffee and your comics to arrive, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our interviews. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Very simple and easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can email the show. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. If you want to email me directly, I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us on Twitter. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs. And thanks to everyone who continues to retweet our tweets. We're also on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. You can even find us on YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can also stream us on Stitcher, find us on TuneIn, and of course you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at the website, comicsalternative.com. So if you want to hear other cool conversations with creators like Isaac Cates and Mike Wenthe, then come back to the Comics Alternative, because we have a lot lined up for you in the coming months. Until then, I'm Derek, and I'll see you in the funny papers.